first of all, thank you again, everybody, for participating in this. My talk is not necessarily, not at all, actually, except for the one final slide on food. What I thought I would do is just give us an overall vision of what the Global Systemic Risk Project is, and then we can start grafting how food, I think you'll agree that food fits into a lot of these issues. So we start with something, an immodest claim of the paradox to modernity. And basically, we've gotten much more efficient. We've gotten much better at doing what we do. We've become much more connected. We have increased capacity for aggregation and control. But the side of that, this follows John's comment yesterday, is that we're growing increasingly dependent on each other, and we have this greater social vulnerability. So we're essentially paying for our wealth with fragility. We're paying for our wealth with mutual dependence. So we have these increasing complexity of global flows, and this leads to systemic fragility. So we have large number of interacting components. We have critical thresholds in just about every single flow. We've got adaptability to random disruptions, but, and here comes the problem, highly vulnerable to widespread failure, near total dependence on global flows, and catastrophic consequences of breakdown of flows. And particularly, we have something that we're calling emergent risk. And let me tell you a little bit about what we mean by this. By emergent risk, we mean that it's the danger of being an apple in the barrel. That is, it's the dangers that come not from any particular characteristic of any of the apples in the barrel, but by being in the barrel together, this produces conditions which are unpredictable, which make the system very vulnerable to small perturbations and cannot be predicted. It's nonlinear, and this risk is one that we're running as we're increasing the number of networks, as we're connecting networks together. These networks, even though they might be fairly resilient in and of themselves, when you start linking a whole variety of networks, they become less resilient. This is a basic finding from network theory. And we're interested in all sorts of domains, from shipping lanes to air traffic, information flows, financial capital flows, fuel and energy, water, and obviously food and agriculture. And one of the things that we want to do as we have conferences on these various domains is to have people come back and come to conferences that are not necessarily in their domain so they can see whether their particular domain fits into this broader image. I suspect, and this is what I'm finding after a year and a half of doing this, that many of the people who are working on these various things are using the same verbs, it's just different nouns. That the sentence structure, in a sense of what we're trying to figure out and the problems are very, very similar, whether we're talking about dollars, whether we're talking about corn, whether we're talking about oil. And we can learn a great deal from each other. So the perspective is just a network of networks. And again, because it's a network of networks, that lends itself to greater fragility. And we can see, I've been doing this for about 10 years, it's been a sideline of mine, of trying to figure out the world's plumbing. If we think about the global flows that are linking, and we start thinking about all these, or heating, if you've ever been into a massive skyscraper and you go look at the heating and air conditioning system, well, imagine that worldwide, and imagine that also as a series of arrays. So you're going to have, we have food, by the way, if you want to map out food trade, we have this, I can tell people how to get to it. We have a little tool that allows you to map food trade. We have shipping lines, we have networks, et cetera. How do all these combine, and how in the process of combining them do they create a risk? So we want to know whether this systemic risk, whether this emergent risk is real. This is against every single principle of my discipline that no longer does any kind of descriptive work, because everything has to be causal. We're taking one step back and saying, before we start figuring out the causality here, let's actually try to find out what is going on. To what extent is the system paying for this efficiency with this fragility? And then, hopefully, at the very end, come with some kind of prescriptive policy analysis. Are there policies, are there regulations, are there mechanisms in order to mitigate this? Now, what we have found so far is a whole bunch of commonalities, in a sense, across all these various domains. And you have specialization of production versus subsistence and self-sufficiency. So that's what's driving a lot of this, is this increasing pressure to specialize. We've taken Adam Smith at his word, and we're all now just making little parts of the pin, as it were. Now, again, this is driven by efficiency reasons, but it has its dangers. The comparative advantage, again, this idea that the specialization is the great invention in a sense of modernity. So to some extent, all these systems, whether it's fuel, whether it's internet, whether it's food, whether it's whatever, is suffering from or gaining from this great specialization, but also possibly some suffering from it. You've got a diversity of consumption, so now individuals are consuming and demanding a broader basket, which means that the plumbing gets even more complicated. My favorite example of this is I still remember when I was an undergraduate, even as a graduate student, if you traveled to Europe, you would bring back Toblerone for people. Now you can find Toblerone in a 7-Eleven somewhere in Topeka. In a sense, our basket that we're depending on has become much more complex. What we consider as basic needs have become much more complex and much more demanding. We have much less on reserve. Their whole principle, I got an MBA before I got a PhD, and one of the principles that I learned was maintaining low inventory. Just-in-time inventory is the dominant theme in business. This is what keeps FedEx in line. So you don't want to keep any kind of reserve. And again, you can think about this in terms of fuel, or you can think about this in terms of food, or capital reserves that banks are forced to have. That is, that we're forcing the system to ever be more efficient, to always depend on the continuance of the flow, and any disruption of that flow can't be backed up by some kind of reserve. And we have increasing reliance on technology and this interconnectedness. The speed of propagation, of contagion, of dependence has become much, much higher. Because any kind of news, whether it's good or it's bad, can flow very, very quickly. Any kind of disruption, my favorite example of this is the unpronounceable volcano in Iceland. When that goes off in 2010, not only just disrupts the North Atlantic air highway, but actually leads within about 8 hours, starts leading into flight delays all the way into South Asia. So this ability of the system, to reestablish autarky in times of need has gone down. We also have human constraints. There's a belief that tomorrow is just going to be like yesterday, or as it happened before 2008, even better. The hubris and confidence of knowledge and education. We believe that we can understand all of these systems. My colleagues over in Fisher Hall and Econ still believe, absolutely, that their models will respond to anything, and that 2008 was an unfortunate blip. You've got selfish behavior to withdraw from network in times of risk. We've talked about this with food crisis when you put export controls. So when you get times of risk, when you get times of crisis, you don't come together. Everybody starts trying to get their own lifeboat. And this leads to very, very quick contagion and dispersal of danger. You have a difficulty modeling. Herbert Simon talked about bounded rationality. I think even with all our great data management and data hunting, there is a bounded amount of information that we can absorb. Looking at this system, that the system has become much more complex than our ability to understand it. We have difficulty measuring and agreeing on metrics. Individuals and organizations don't understand timescales. The discount ratios are completely off. We have about a 3-month discount ratio for life, and yet we have a planet that we can't escape from. There's moral hazard, and of course, there's always malfeasance. And I should add, Max Professor Juan Lin said, social science has erred by not including into its equations human stupidity. So we have malfeasance and stupidity. That errors are going to happen, and this system can't be very stable. And my favorite example of how these systems communicate is this link. Now, correlation is not causation, but sometimes you want to make it so. If you look at the relationship, for example, between a food price index and the kind of social revolts that we've seen over the last 10 years. So here's just one example of how one perturbation in the system, one change in the system, the increase in the price of a particular commodity can lead to this kind of social chaos for which we're not ready. And on that happy theme, I'll stop. Thank you very much.
Okay, I've got a relatively limited objective here. What I want to do is to talk about climate change and the impact, the role that managing agriculture and the food network can have in mitigating climate change, and how, in a nutshell, how little from a global perspective there is to gain and how much we potentially have to lose. All right. So the easiest way to figure out how much mitigation potential there is to simply look at how much the development of the agricultural system has done to the global warming problem since we got started. Most of this happened since 1861, and here are some numbers. There have been about 160 gigatons of carbon from all sources of land clearing in that 150-year period. To put that into perspective, I use gigatons of carbon. Think about global fossil emissions as being about 10 gigatons of carbon, and global land use emissions as currently being about 1 or 1.5 gigatons of carbon. So 10 units and 1 unit for fossil emissions versus land use emissions. This is 160 gigatons. It's 16 years of current emissions. It's about that amount. So this is a substantial number, but it is not a titanic number. So 66 gigatons of this are because of timber cutting on the 1.3 billion hectares of secondary forest, that is forest that was cut down once but allowed to regrow. There's 2.5 billion hectares of primary, that is never cut down forest, still left, so 2/3 of it. 42 gigatons were because of tree removal from forests converted to cropland. There are about 1.5 billion hectares of cropland worldwide, maybe 1.6 billion hectares now. 50 gigatons of carbon from cropland and pasture soils because the soils became degraded when we used them. And there are currently 3.3 billion hectares of pasture, and as I said, 1.6 billion hectares of cropland. All right? Roughly 1/3 of historic global warming was caused by land use change. In very rough terms, about 1/3 of global warming has been caused by it. Now, I find that even very sophisticated audiences sometimes get confused about how land use change causes emissions and how it can mitigate them. And so it's really useful to keep a very simple cartoon in your mind. These diagrams show how much carbon a hectare of land stores, and these are averages worldwide. It's a productivity weighted average, all right, that we took from a model data fusion. And also the roundest numbers that I can come up with, right? And so primary forest, never cut down forest, has about 200 tons per hectare above ground in the vegetation and 100 tons in the soil. Grassland has a small 5 tons. Almost all the carbon in the biosphere that's living is wood, all right, or used to be wood. And 150 tons below ground. Notice this is bigger. Pasture has about 9 above ground and 125 below ground. And cropland has a paltry 2 above ground and 75 below ground because a lot of the carbon gets aerated from the continual turning of the soil and other things. Now, if we take a primary forest and convert it into a cropland, that represents, after all of the dynamics take place, a one-time transfer of 200 minus 2, 198 tons of carbon to the atmosphere, and 100 to 75, 25 tons of soil carbon to the atmosphere. If we convert a grassland into a cropland, you get 3 in the vegetation and 75 below ground. If you go the other way and take, say, a cropland and turn it back into a forest, you have a one-time transfer from the atmosphere back onto the land surface. So all this talk about growing trees and they eventually fall down and the carbon goes back into the atmosphere, forget all about that. It's all about the biosphere gaining or losing weight once in the transfer. Those dynamics take a long time, but that's the way to think about it. Managing the land gives you a one-time transfer of a bulk of carbon, and it's just the weight gain before to after, or the weight loss before to after. All right. Now, you can use all of this to figure out what the global potential is for mitigating carbon dioxide buildup in the atmosphere by changing land use. And the numbers are just not very impressive. All right, it depends on how you look at them, I suppose. If you drove tropical deforestation to zero, you remove something like 1.5 gigatons of carbon per year of emissions, which is about 15% of emissions. It might be closer to 10% now because that number's gone down a little bit. So this is either a big number or a small number, depending upon how you look at it. From my perspective, what it means is that this is an order of magnitude down from the primary culprit. Primary culprit is, of course, fossil fuels. If you dicker with this, and instead of dickering with fossil fuels, you're dickering with a low-order part of the problem, and that's a problem. You're not going to solve the problem this way, but it's material, on the edge, right? So it's an order of magnitude down. Restoration of cropland and pasture soils would remove a total of 50 gigatons of carbon of emissions, one-time transfer. That's roughly 5 years of current fossil emissions. Would represent 25 parts per million in the atmosphere, whereas fossil fuels are going to be responsible for the addition, if we don't do something about them, of hundreds of parts per million added to the atmosphere. So this is, again, material, but at least an order of magnitude down. In contrast, from an individual's perspective, individual's landholder's perspective, the flows involved in this could actually be quite large. So there are multiple demonstrations that just by changing cultivation practice a little bit, you can store an extra 0.5 ton of carbon per hectare at no extra cost. And you might actually receive a substantial payment from that in a carbon-constrained world where there was a price on the carbon. Restoration of cropland and pasture soils could cancel a landowner's personal fossil emissions relatively easily. So there's enough in this to incentivize individuals to dicker with the food system, but not enough really to save the problem, all right? Beyond that, playing with this system, in particular, expansion of agriculture has the potential to actually be a major disruption in the carbon cycle, and I want to talk about this now. This is an old diagram, and I put it up here because this is the first one that this Global Carbon Project came up with. They just came up with a new one, and they're always the same. In this case, in this year, I think it was 2000, averages from 2000 to 2008, there were only 7.7 billion metric tons of carbon from fossil fuels on average, and there were 1.4 from tropical deforestation. Only 45% of those total emissions ended up in the atmosphere. That's a long-term average that is true, okay? That has been true for a very long time now. 45% ends up in the atmosphere, 55% gets mitigated for free. A third of the total emissions go into weight by the terrestrial biosphere. That is thought to be due to CO2 fertilization. This is a huge CO2 fertilization project that's happened all over the world. When you add CO2 to the atmosphere, plants gain weight. That's what's thought to be responsible for that. The community thinks, this is Liebig's law of the minimum, the water barrel's water level depends on the most limiting nutrient, thinks the plants are going to run out of nitrogen, all right, which is going to ultimately cancel this. If that were to happen, this is what our model at GFDL says would happen to the global biosphere. The CO2 fertilization persists. If we double the pre-industrial atmospheric CO2 and stabilize at 550 parts per million, which is a little above the 2-degree target, the biosphere would gain 218 petagrams of carbon. That's a pretty big number. 20 years of emissions would be mitigated one time. If the CO2 fertilization sink were to fail, we lose 444. The swing is over 600. This is a catastrophe. This response, the persistence of the sink, depends on native lands, depends on native forests. If those disappear, this disappears. And the consequences are large enough that it probably wouldn't be possible to stop the atmosphere at 550 parts per million, even if you eliminated fossil fuel emissions, all right? Just from the losses from the biosphere. So that's it.
Good morning. This morning I got up after 6 hours of sleep. I realized I have 10 to 15 IQ points less. I had a coffee and put together my own summary of what I've heard since yesterday. I've put together 3 slides. If you see more than 3, tell me how you do that. Yeah. I've taken a step back into what I've heard so far, because this is the prepare and repair session, right? And that's what I'm frequently asked by colleagues and the press in Europe, in Austria, kind of having heard all that, what are we doing now with it? And how can we repair the system? And well, my answer is always the same. I don't know. I have no clue, because I don't know how to organize a couple of 100 million people around something that is in their best interest. And I think this is a critical question we have to ask. So where are we since yesterday? Well, we've heard a lot about good news, that agricultural research increased productivity and yields in Asia in particular, not so much in Africa, though for the last 5-7 years Africa is kind of making things up. There's also bad news and concerns. Environmental degradation is still an issue. Planetary boundaries is in the media. This is a picture from our work in Ethiopia. A huge gully, one of the 100,000 gullies that we observe, that colleagues in Ethiopia observe, representing a challenge that is a challenge for many other countries as well. I'm just picking Ethiopia as an example. When we asked farmers what is happening here, their response is, well, the soil's being flushed away. What's the reason? Well, overstocking. Now, what's the reason for overstocking? Well, there's no reason for that. If you dig deeper, you end up in the spiritual sphere, and farmers would say, well, this is actually an outcome of God's will. Now, if it is an outcome of God's will, it's fairly difficult to intervene technically, right? And that's why a lot of soil and water conservation structures that have put in place by technical cooperation have bounced back to something where it were before, after the project has gone away. So, what does that mean? That means that we need to do things differently, and I'm here to make a plea for transformative change, something that more and more people pick up. But I argue that transformative change is way too big for us in order to manage it. So what we need to do is kind of multiple co-evolving sustainability transitions that accumulate in transformative change. And transformative change is a change that really changes the operating system of how we deal with climate change, with food and food systems, with agriculture, etc. I said transformative changes in the media, but it's also in the literature. You can see what is happening here. Since 2005, the term peaks, and it seems to become a new narrative that pleas for business as usual is not enough. We need to change course of direction. But doing so is extremely difficult. There are very few examples of real transformations. Well, 89, the fall of the Berlin Wall is one. That change was so significant that an entire society, Eastern Germany, became a new country. It's part of Germany as we know it today. Now, my observation is that, and what we've been discussing since yesterday, is that the change that we address is important, but very often it's just transactional. It's fixing the system here and there. It's not transformative. And why is it not transformative? Because transformative change is something we can observe after it has happened. It's very difficult to manage it in a proactive way. And that's why I argue for sustainability transitions, because they are much more easy to manage and to maneuver. And several intertwined sustainability transitions make up a transformation. The outcome is uncertain. We don't know where those coupled sustainability transitions would take us to. There are challenges, and I want to mention 3 challenges that I see. The first one is conceptual, the second one is methodological, the third one is mindsets. So concepts, methods, and mindsets. We're dealing with complexity. Miguel has mentioned it before. Many of you have done so. And do we really understand complex dynamical systems? I would say not really. Yeah? And this is a challenge for agriculture in particular. There is good news in other sectors. There is good news in the energy sector, infrastructure. They're dealing with complex adaptive systems as we should do. Interestingly, I run into middle-range theories in the nursing literature. The nursing literature is full of transitions, transition theories that I think agriculture can learn a lot from. So the conceptual challenge, the first one is critical because of that complexity. It's not new. It has been in the literature since the 80s and 90s. But it's something that the agri community would have to take up. Second challenge is the methodological one. Complex dynamical systems are difficult to steer. The system would bounce back because of its self-organizing nature, but what we can do is to nudge it, to coach it, to accompany a change that is in the best interest of system actors. For that, we need to know more about leverage points and where to intervene. I call these leverage points the acupuncture points that really would make a difference. And do we know where these are? Well, we've heard the indicator story this morning. There's much more experimental work that I guess we need to do to identify those leverage points, irrespective of the level, local level, regional, as well as global level. And this is work we do a lot of. That's work we do with students, global learning alliances, to identify leverage points and to allow students to experience where the leverage points of a system is by them kind of playing system actors. The third one is, to me, the most important one. It's the mindset challenge, because this is the operating system of every decision that we take. And I guess we need to know much more about the grammar, the rules and regulations that guide human behavior. We've heard a little bit about it yesterday morning. We need to do much more about the underlying basis of human decision making, how to organize 100 million people around something that is in their best interest. And for doing so, it's not enough just to go or kind of maneuver at knowledge, capability, skills level. We really have to dig down into the attitudes, the values, the beliefs, and the mindsets of people. The values are critical because that's masterminding decisions. And global value surveys would clearly tell that, for instance, a country like Ethiopia rates employment as the key thing at cost of environmental degradation. It's 15 to 20% of the population in Ethiopia would say, well, environmental conservation is important, whereas 80% would say, well, it's employment. If you go to Norway, it's the other way around. Yeah, completely different. But values are key because they decide what we do. And for doing that, for engaging in sustainability transitions, we need three things: acceptance, legitimization, and of course, the 100 million people that we engage with, something that is in their best interest. And I believe that there is an academic task that we have here, and that is to better understand sustainability transition and how we can couple those to become a transformative change maker. That's what I have to contribute to, and that's my summary.
So, like Rob, I don't know where Rob went, but like Rob was saying yesterday, and like Steve's coming from today, so I'm sort of coming from the climate and energy world. I know not that much about agriculture, but I want to do a couple of things in the 5 minutes I have. So one is sort of present some work that we did sort of trying to look at climate change economic risk to the U.S. with a focus on sort of agricultural risk, so building off of what Wolfram was talking about. And then I want to ask a question about what sort of decision support tools might be useful as we're thinking about these long-term sustainability transitions. I think generally I'm interested in sort of the question of, you know, how do we manage and govern sort of risks that have both long-term consequences and you know, sort of are increasing over time, climate change being the one I think about most. But I want to tell you a little bit about one of the sorts of support tools that's been developed in the climate energy community, integrated assessment modeling, and ask whether there's ways that might better dock to the agricultural community. So for the first point, I want to show you just excerpts from some work that we did as part of something called the Risky Business Project, which was chaired by Michael Bloomberg and Tom Steyer and Hank Paulson. And we did a technical analysis called the American Climate Perspectives. And one of the things we did throughout this was sort of take some of the empirical work that people like Wolfram has done and couple that with sort of probabilistic projections of physical climate changes over the next century to look at how some of these, to first order how some of these economic risks are evolving. You know, this is just basically the question of the climate change impact. We're not looking at what we'll get to in the second part, which is how those are evolving in sort of a context of changing socioeconomics. But for this part, we start with work like that Wolfram's done. So here, you know, that figure up in the upper left is more or less exactly the one Wolfram showed. So of response to a degree of a given temperature in terms of maize yields, and Wolfram and others have done work on a variety of crops. In some of these crops, we see this difference between the eastern and western halves of the United States that have to do with irrigation and how that alters the temperature response. And then, as we've already mentioned, right, there's the potential influence of CO2 fertilization to affect that as well. So we took these sorts of empirical work and combined them with probabilistic projections for different climate change scenarios of temperature and precipitation. And this is sort of, I've condensed it all into a handful of slides. This is sort of one of the punchline graphs. So what this is showing, I think is one way of thinking of that sort of interesting. Is if we think about a 20-year interval, and we think about, say, if we looked at the last 20 or 30 years, you know, what is the 1 in 20-year crop loss event? So of the last 20 years, what was the worst crop loss event? To do some statistics so it's not too numerically unstable. And then you ask, how is the likelihood of a year like that expected to change over time, taking into account the uncertainty? So here you're looking at sort of different 20-year intervals. So the last one over on the right would be the 20-year interval beginning 2080. And the question is, given all the uncertainties, what's your expectation of the number of years in that 20-year interval that will be like a current 1 in 20-year event? And so what you can see is that, you know, a range of climate change scenarios from RCP 8.5, which is sort of like a high-end business as usual scenario, to RCP 2.6, which is the one most compatible with a 2°C target, all see an increase in sort of these extreme crop loss events, you know, relative to contemporary production, right? So not taking into account, this is not relative to you know, yield today, because of course there's going to be other things influencing the baseline yield. This is sort of the climate-related loss event. And you can see this increase, and you can also see a significant divergence, you know, in the RCP 8.5, just taking some of those empirical relationships and combining them with temperature projections. What you see is sort of what was once the 1 in 20-year climatic shock sort of becomes the new norm. And ultimately, of course, that just will show up in slower yield productivity increases. You know, then also this is yield we're looking at. So in the report we look at the supply question, and we just raised earlier sort of how is it the question of how supply is changing over time. I think that's something very important to think about. How are we going to smooth out shocks if they're becoming more frequent? This is also another sort of key point. So looking at those relationships by region. So each of these different bars are looking at a particular region and looking at one of these scenarios. And we're, again, the main point here is first of all, there's a lot of uncertainty in the agricultural system. I don't need to tell you that. We get these complexities of sign, largely having to do with the fact that we include CO2 fertilization. If CO2 fertilization does not pan out, you get a lot of shifts downward. But you're looking sort of in regions that are not using irrigated agriculture of potential changes that are relative to are something like 20 to 60% likely ranges. Now, of course, here we're getting to stuff I really know very little about. These climate impacts are taking place in a background of advances in agricultural technology. This is just a plot I pulled from USDA of sort of total factor productivity in agriculture increasing over time. It's sort of increasing at like sort of a rate of about 0.01 units per year over the last half century. And so if you just continued at that rate, you would get something like a 70% increase relative to 1980 to 2010 by mid-century and over a 100% increase by late century. So the question, how are these two competing factors working? It's a question.
This is not yield.
No, this is total factor productivity.
Much higher than
The yield's been doubling over that period of time, right? But that's because of changes of input too, right? So you have to take into account how are you changing your inputs given that this is the exogenous component that's not input. So that's sort of, okay, that's the first part of the remarks. The second thing I was going to say is that talking about sort of decision support tools. So that was just using empirical work. There's a whole category of models that have been developed over the last 30 years in sort of the climate and energy community that are called integrated assessment models. And there's two sorts of those integrated assessment models. I just want to focus on the part that actually has very detailed representations of different sorts of technologies. And in the 1990s, people really started working on putting in detailed representations of land use as well because of the interactions between things like bioenergy and land use. And so in the US, the two big models are at Pacific Northwest National Labs and at MIT. And this is showing you sort of the different agroecological zones in the GCAM model, which is one of these models. So there's things that are designed to look at questions of if you put a price in carbon, how does that, and you say tax land carbon or don't tax land carbon, how does that affect the composition of the energy system over time? How does that affect demand for land? And I think there's a lot of things that are missing here, and I mean, just some things that I think might influence how we think about climate change mitigation that people here might have insights to that I've sort of picked up. So, okay, first of all, what's missing from these models now? So these models don't actually include the impacts of climate change, but that's a current major research focus. One of the things that became very clear to me as we worked on the risky business stuff is, right, that you've got these changes in the mean state of the climate, but you remember those nonlinear drop-offs that Wolfram was showing, right? That means that the interaction between that mean state and the variability around that mean state is going to matter a lot. And I think that's true economically too, or potentially, right? So these are 5-year time-step models. Short-term storage, shock storage, export restrictions, the sort of things we were just talking about aren't in here. How do those change the average response of the system? I think that's a point of communications we need. This community doesn't think much about ecological functions, so weeds, pest, pestilence, how does that going to change over with climate? Ecosystem services, that's sort of something we discussed a little bit yesterday. I think we need to think about more. We haven't, these models don't yet have a detailed nitrogen cycle, and we were just talking about yesterday had both of these sort of extremes of nitrogen over-application and sort of the transition in places like China and these sort of very large loss of nitrogen in places like Africa. How does that interact with the ability of the soil to provide food, provide the energy resources? Institutions and market failures are something that's come up a lot here. This comes from a worldview of essentially looking at the planet has something that ultimately finds a market equilibrium when you average out over enough years. to what extent do we fall below that? And then the other thing is questions of sort of how does wealth distribution affect, we've talked a lot about subsistence, climate, how does wealth distribution, how do these human rights issues, how do we incorporate these in towards our thinking about the sort of long-term evolution of the coupled climate, energy, land system? So I'll conclude. I've been least good on time of all the speakers, so that makes me a bad moderator so far. But perhaps then we can take questions from the panel on any of the other talks.
So global trade in food, as you point out, clearly reduces the impact of local famines because there's a redundant supply that you can move. But the transport costs keep redundancy in the system. And so it's just not obvious to me that that interconnectedness is even mostly or usually bad. It is mostly or usually, even if it mostly or usually decreases the stability of the system.
I don't want to make this argument, a Luddite argument for let's go back to autarky, okay? Yes, there are all sorts of benefits there, but my whole point is, along with these benefits comes particular dangers. So let's take the shipping. Something like 80% of the world's goods is transported in container ships. And about 85% of those have to go through six or seven choke points. The Malacca Straits, the Straits of Hormuz, the Panama Canal, etc. One break in one of those, one disruption in something like the Malacca Straits, for example, can contage and cascade throughout the system much faster than before. Now, should we just should we go back to a world without trade, without these connectedness? No, but let's simply be aware that that connection does come at some kind of price. And I think what we've done, and the obvious model for this is 2007, 2008, is this assumption that the system will clear, that the market will clear, that you will be able to have this resolution of these various crises through the very mechanisms at hand. Well, I'm not so certain about that. I think there's enough friction in the system where you might not be able to do it. And I think 2008 is an example of that.
Okay, so why don't we take 3 questions, or Rob?
Can I respond?
Oh, sure.
That reminds me of the example I've mentioned, I think 2 times over coffee break. I have a friend who is a pilot of an A380 plane, and he would tell me that it's a perfect plane, but if something happens, they couldn't fix it. So in a 99.9% it works well, and they all pray that nothing happens because they couldn't fix it when they're at high altitude. If you translate that to food systems, I wonder whether there is something we can learn from that example. The Netherlands depends on one major retailer for the entire supply. Austria on 4. It's highly concentrated, and do we understand that complexity behind that concentration? And if not, are we able to fix things when a problem emerges? I think that was the question that I heard.
Yeah. And if I could just, the example that I use sometimes when I explain to the students is, would you rather have a 1967 Volkswagen Bug or a 2014 Lamborghini? Well, it very much depends what you're trying to do. If you want to go 200 miles an hour on an Autobahn, the Lamborghini is much better. If you're crossing the desert and all you have to fix the engine is a bunch of duct tape and a stick, I'll take the 1966 Beetle anytime. So yes, we're increasingly driving a Lamborghini and it works beautifully. But one small thing, and the maintenance costs of a Lamborghini are massive. You want to do I read this somewhere about a Porsche, some model of Porsche. An oil change is $850. Okay, an oil change. So what that tells me is this thing works beautifully. It is a monument to human invention. but it's also very fragile and very expensive to keep up. And if the conditions aren't there, then you're stuck with a very, very expensive couch.
I'd sell the Lamborghini and buy 5 Toyota Land Cruisers. Take them all across the
I'm going to take Ferrari, just throw in a thought. The question: if you build up these complex networks, and if they have choke points, expect them to get more complex over time and sort of less flexible. So the example I'm thinking about that I use sometimes, if you think about the electric grid, it's our New York and New Jersey area. If you go back and look at a map of the sort of New York area electric grid in 1910, and you look at where all the generating and switching stations were, and you look at where all the where the switching stations are today, you can find many of those places on that map in 1910. If you look at the subset of switching stations that flooded during Superstorm Sandy, about 2/3 of those, or maybe 3/4 of them, were sited sometime around 1900. Right? So the network topology sort of built up among those choices, and then we're in this sort of changing environment, and you're coping with these lock-in effects. Are there analogs to that you could draw from agriculture?
Well, certainly one of the basic principles of complexity theory, and again, I love it when social science discovered history, path dependence. One of the lessons that we learn from complexity is it all comes down to where you begin. So we are dealing with a legacy, a system that was designed in a particular way for particular conditions. So we have all these legacies built in. Do we know, are those legacies adequate? This is the other thing, it's not a completely dynamic system, because when we were talking about, and I'll shut up, when we were talking about reserves, et cetera, I was thinking, yeah, fine, we might have all this wheat stored somewhere, but do we have the infrastructure to be able to transport this reserve somewhere? In 2008, we didn't just lose money. The capital didn't just disappear. It just wasn't in the right places at the right moment. So do we have the infrastructure set up in order to maintain this complex system? No.
Well, here, so that's why we are talking about decentralized reserves. And how much? For example, maybe around the corner of Africa, million tons of wheat, some other grains over there, another couple of million tons from somewhere in West Africa. So when the prices come, at least in 3 months, you can move the food around. In the meantime, you try to import large amount from other countries. Now, I was in Singapore, I was in some of the Middle East countries. They import 90%, maybe even 99% of their food. They're very worried about the global trade system. If there is some sort of failure somewhere, then in 5 years, sorry, not in 5 days, 5 days, you won't have enough food to feed the population.
Just to that point, the time scale is really important. And if you think, just the example, there was a great book on the Irish famine by John Kelly 2 years ago, and the problem was, well, the crop was destroyed over a 3-week period, and then, in terms of the relief effort, the distribution was very problematic to get the food to the country, to have the mills to process that those grains that they weren't in place. So you have this short window with which to respond to any disturbance. So I think to the point of food reserves, I think they need to be sort of at least at the national level or clusters of countries in close proximity.
Just to respond to that comment you made initially on linking dynamical systems, I think there is some caution and humility that needs to be embedded in any assertions based on the mathematics of dynamical systems. The linkages between dynamical systems and networks and extreme value theory. So how a complex network would react to a shock and maybe change an equilibrium state, reach a bifurcation, is still a very cutting-edge research area that still has not been resolved. So poking a complex system supposing that we are on an equilibrium state with a lot of redundancies, that might be a real dangerous exercise. To go in the direction of Miguel, Centeno, and to ask a question as well. Another example of this, the comparison of the Lamborghini with the 1960s Beetle, is the food retail sector. Today, these massive corporations, the Walmart, the Carrefour, they have global supply chains. They have tens and tens of commodities. Maybe like a corporation like food retailer has 50 key commodities that are key to their business, but they don't know what are their top 10 suppliers, because what separates them from the producers and what they put on the shelves are maybe 3 layers of intermediaries, and so they're incapable of quantifying robustly the risks that they are taking in the food system. And so, coming to my question is like, what, in your opinion, or in your opinions, what would be the node or the nodes in the system that would need to be nudged or simplified or maybe complexified to build more resilience in the food system?
Yeah, I certainly do not know enough about food or any of the substantial domains to be able to answer that question. But the project, what this project's trying to do, is exactly that. If you want to think about it, the counter version is, what's a terrorist's dream? What's the node that you can knock out that will bring everything down or will disrupt the most? I think we need to do a lot. I don't have an answer, but I think, yeah, if they had, thank God they were kind of stupid, and they did it at the World Trade Center as opposed to some data bank somewhere in Bayonne, because that might have been much more dangerous and much more catastrophic to the system. It might have cost fewer human lives immediately. I don't know the answer to that, but I think we have to, I would suggest that there is a great deal to be produced by trying to map these out, by doing thousands upon thousands of iterations of the world network where you knock out one node at a time, for example, or you knock out one link and you see exactly what sort of the iterations may be. As far as I know, we're not doing that. Those kind of Santa Fe models with the food system, as far as I know.
So maybe take 3 questions on this sort of network stability issue. Yeah.
That's the network. I also have a question in this regard. I found graphs very interesting. They looked at the flows of energy, capital, air flows, and so on. And I wonder if migration would not fit into that picture also. The migration as a result of poverty in rural areas, but also as a result of the expected rise of the levels of ocean and so on, and how that would fit into, let's say, the elements that you have shown.
Okay.
What Miguel and Michael have talked about really does relate to the whole concept of wicked problems. Right, in the sense that you're structuring your look at these things in a very different way. And one of the key things that the wicked problem people would talk about is adaptive management. And I would see adaptive management as a very important part of both of you are talking about.
Okay, one more.
Yeah, so on the stability of the large-scale system, I think it's really problematic to hinge a lot of the analytical focus and certainly political action at that level. If your only ability to infer the stability of the system is just the frequency and magnitude of the catastrophic breakdowns, you would have to conclude that we're getting more and more resilient, steadily over the last 2 centuries. But we don't believe that. We think we're at a juncture where the future is getting much riskier. We're like the Princeton students in 1936 that formed a group they called the Veterans of Future Wars. And they argued that the next World War was going to be so horrible that they would not survive, so they wanted their veterans benefits now. But we're going to make that argument and have it be politically relevant. we need to translate these risks into very specific things that are already motivating and mobilizing political constituencies in ways that they can understand. It's going to be much more specific than the whole system is unstable, because I think empirically that's just not believable.
All right, so we've got a question about migration, about adaptive management, and about making in-system instability more concrete. So, anybody here?
The migration is clearly part of this. I have a graduate student who's mapped out migration and tourist flows. There's a very big, there's a wonderful scholar in Italy, whose name I can't remember right now, who's looking at the relationship between migration and trade. So yes, no, migration is, I mean, Ebola is obviously the carrier for this, and also that some systems do depend on its continual flow. My favorite example of the complex systems is a place like Dubai. There is no reason for Dubai to continue to exist, except that the system just keeps it going. And if you eliminate the connection to, all of a sudden, there's no more flights from Bangladesh. Dubai stopped working. So, I mean, yes, it has to be included. On adaptive management, this is one of the questions, and again, I don't have an answer to. Do you need to do this adaptive management at the very local ground level? That is, you let the solution emerge just like the problem has emerged, or do you have to have some kind of top-down? I don't have an answer to that, but I think that's one of the questions. How much do we want to impose some kind of control over this from the top, and how much do we want to adjust it by every small action going?
My concern there would not be the locus of the adaptive management, but having adaptive management built into the system. That's my
Except I would argue that adaptive management is expensive. If your only measure of success is how well you did yesterday, having the possibility of recovery from a bad yesterday doesn't pay off in many models.
Good adaptive management looks forward, and it says, here we are now, let's take a new path, because the old path went from point A to point B. We find ourselves here somewhere. How do we get there, or is there a new goal?
Okay. I'm sorry, on the resilience, there are two responses. I think a lot of this has to do with human values, and what we, in the 21st century, our acceptance of human suffering is much lower, thank God, than it was in the 19th. So resilience, in some ways, is a relative, okay, at one point in time when losing 50 million people had been acceptable, it no longer is. So I think that resilience measure is, could a lot of this stuff be resolved if half the world's population disappeared? Maybe, but are we willing to make that value choice? So that question of resilience is iffy. And I'm not quite sure we are a more resilient system. And again, my model for this, the one I know fairly well, is the 2000 and 2008 financial crisis, where we had created an incredibly efficient capital distribution system. But we had made one where the real estate prices in Vegas could bring down banks in Germany. That, to me, seems to indicate that in some ways we have lowered our resilience.
Just on the point or level of intervention, as much as I believe we should identify those leverage points from a terrorist perspective and ask ourselves, what's the worst case? I asked that question. What's the worst case that could happen? Simply to get prepared. But when it comes to transitions and sustainability transitions, I very much believe in local level action. And you would have, and that's what transition theories would tell us, you would have to isolate your venture from the mainstream for some time and get it out, regime forces into a niche, and then nurture, groom the alternative and gradually translate it back into the regime, and through that also modify regime forces. If you leave the good idea at that high level, the regime would change it immediately and it would not survive. So I believe local level action is key, but there's a role for intergovernmental processes as well, because they would have to set the framework for those niches to emerge and to survive.
Rob.
I have several comments which amount to research problem. One, Bob, is your slide still on there?
No, I can put it up.
Doesn't really matter, but there's a major defect in these models that isn't on your list, which is that they can't deal with pace, how fast market share can change.
Yep.
And that in general, this seems to be why under-researched problem bears on the climate and energy system as well. How fast can actually change? What do we know about what sets limits on that? What happens when you go too fast? So that's a systems question that seems definitely understudied. Another is that when you talk about how we've been shrinking reserves, the concept of over-engineering, whether it's a bridge or a tank that holds a fluid or whatever, I think is one that you could demonstrably show that we are doing less over-engineering than we did, say, 50 years ago. So there's another way of getting at this question of whether we are making our systems more taut and more fragile. Because why pay the extra for whatever? And I think if you demonstrate that, it would be a very interesting place to go with some students.
Rob, can you define what you mean by over-engineering?
I'll tell you a story. I had 2 oil tanks under my, at the front, buried oil tanks at my house when I switched to gas because it's a very bad thing to have oil tanks in New Jersey. One was 50 years old. One was 20 years old. Which one would you think would be more likely to have shown the consequences of wear? Well, the 20-year-old one did. Was it had a thinner boundary. And that's an example. You could talk about how bridges are built, and you have the same answer, I'm pretty sure. Or refrigerators and how long they're supposed to go before they collapse and so on. We built a lot of shortening we've reduced over-engineering, I believe, but I think we could have interesting other domains where it isn't true. I don't know of any, but it might be. Finally, I think a lot of what we've been talking about is about fuses. It's about failing gracefully. We haven't used those words, but when systems break, they can break badly or they can break intelligently. And the fuse is the way in which we deal with electric shocks and houses. And insurance is a kind of fuse. Quarantine is a kind of fuse, which we're dealing with now with Ebola. I think it's a useful concept. And I haven't heard it. Finally, Miguel, I think World Trade Center might have been the best target for Osama. He wanted to create disruption far more than a data center. If he hit us symbolically, we reacted symbolically, we now have a crusade, an era of crusades that God knows how long it will last. I don't think he could have done that if he did that. Data center.
All right, so maybe 2 more questions, and then I sort of want to see if we can transition to thinking about how we take these abstract concepts and apply them particularly to agriculture, if we have some discussion about that. But.
Yes, I want to build real quick on what Rob said about insurance. So the claim is that because of the capitalist mentality, storage is not efficient. But in the whole insurance industry is built around the concept that I'm going to set aside some kind of resources on the expectation that something bad might happen in the future. So why can't we have this kind of mentality in terms of the food system? The storage would be some kind of insurance.
Okay. And any more on abstract theory versus?
I just had one question on the trade-off between global system resilience and the local system resilience. It's a trade-off. But right now you said that nobody has looked at the weakest nodes in the food system. In fact, many countries have done that. National level intelligence unit has done that. They don't want to tell you, otherwise the terrorists will know, but that's the only. The problem is when a country begins to build their resilience, then the global system actually suffers. How can we work together to make sure that we all work together to make sure, on the one hand, that we have a relatively decentralized system at a local, national level, so the diseases or the problem will not translate to the global level. On the other hand, at the global level, how can we make sure that everybody do work together to minimize the cost? So the trade-off between the global system and the national system needs to be taken seriously.
So we had questions on over-engineering and on failing gracefully, on sort of storage as a type of insurance, and can we have competition between different levels of resilience? And there's like another example of that is if you think of flood levees, right? So that's a case where your sort of local resilience, you know, if one town, if you're getting flooded on one side of the river and you build up your levees, then then the other side has to build up their levees, or they're going to get flooded instead. So any thoughts on that?
Sorry, on the concept of fuses, yeah, no, I think it's exactly, but and this actually applies to the insurance or the trade-offs. One of the things that I'm wrestling with is we're empirical, we're positivists, we believe in and finding the answer in these solutions. But very quickly on, you get to political choices. Fuses have costs. If you're going to have a fuse system, you have to be willing to not have your lights on for the 15 seconds that it takes for you to go downstairs and replace the fuse. That's a political choice. The kind of insurance that, how am I going to be paid back? That's going to be a political choice. This national versus global versus regional, that's going to be a political choice. So I'm not arguing that we're going to find some I don't know how many of you read Douglas Adams, but I don't think that at the end of this project I'm going to get an answer that's going to be 42, and that's going to apply to everything. I think it's just becoming much more conscious of how there's political choices to be made, and there's going to be consequences. One of the things I'll say at the very end when we sum up is, when you're looking at these kinds of systems, you can't get away from the idea of you're going to be determining how you design these systems. Who dies, who survives, who pays, and just to be very aware that there's consequences for any choice that you make in this kind of system about who's going to bear the cost of that system. And just to be aware of that, not as offering a solution to it, but just to be aware of it.
Well, that goes back to values.
Yeah, that goes back to values.
So comments, particularly on agriculture and how that relates to this? Here. Yeah.
I have a question to Michael about transitions and sustainability transitions. I think we have both read these theories, these Dutch theories about transition management that mostly stem from the NC system. And you mentioned the old classical idea that the regimes are very difficult to change. You need very innovative and small actors that do that. Based on what I've been reading very recently considering the energy system is probably applicable to the agricultural system as well, but this isn't necessarily just such a simple question according to scholars anymore. A lot of firms now, they do things like niche management. They actually proactively found these niches, and then they start managing it from their own perspective. Or I think the Dutch government has a concept of transition management actually built in the policy machine. And I don't know if this is a question, but have you thought about the kind of eroding, like some scholars have done, eroding the difference between these innovative small actors and the big conservative actors, whether there's more continuity?
Okay. Other questions? Okay.
Just a quick comment. I mean, I'm just going back to the insurance industry. It's built on numbers, on risk assessments, right? So even though there's political choices attached to them, I'm thinking there's also some kind of risk calculation that you can say with the expected value of the losses that you're going to have in the future times the probability versus the cost that you would have in terms of incurring that initial cost of use.
Just on the agricultural side, one of the things that hasn't been discussed is the nature of prices. And I know prices isn't everything, but when it comes to commodities, prices it is a lot. When you find a binding constraint in any agricultural system, the market prices will adjust so that alternative mechanisms and alternative transport systems can be found. When we were talking yesterday about the price of rice, with the closure of exports from India, for example, and the price goes up to 700. What that is by the bidding country to say, I will pay an excess transportation cost for anybody to bring rice to my country, well above what the market is. When we saw after the 2008 crash, the shorting of working capital, you saw large what are called basis swings in terms of rail transportation, right? So if you have a flood, if the Mississippi dries out, and you now have to transport grain by rail, then all of a sudden the bidding price for freight will increase. And the market will have to adjust in order to absorb that transportation costs because of that, going to higher supply and demand systems. So in a natural network of agricultural commodities, you're always going to get alternative transportation routes, one way or another. But whether the price goes high enough that people will carry it across their back, across the Panama Canal, right, that the market system will eventually signal that price in terms of what the demand unit's going to be. So these network systems you're talking about in an agricultural system cannot be viewed outside of supply-demand, basis separating markets, and prices.
So let's take these three. One thought on that. It seems like your question relates closely to Rob's comment, right, about the question of the pace of market change, right? If prices go high enough, it still takes time to transition from a system where you're shipping through the Straits of Hormuz to carrying grain on foot across the Panama Canal, or whatever alternative is, right? So that seems like that's a potential for instability during that transition time.
We did one thing a couple of years ago, which was very interesting. We were dealing with famine response, and I think we looked at Kenya, and we were looking at the failures of the rainfalls, what I talked about yesterday, in terms of famine conditions that might arise 6 months later. And the timing of that we measured by body wasting, and measurements of muscle in infants and children on that. So we knew there was about 6 months. But we know that aid does not, unless a famine is declared, only then will aid be shipped. And what this early warning systems like using catastrophe bonds that get triggered at the time of the event, right? When the failure happens, and this has a high probability of future famine, that gets triggered so that the aid can then be bought at that time and shipped at that time and stored at that time in preparation for something coming 6 months down the line on that. So there are, again, other sort of mechanisms using insurance and capital markets, which might help in trying to deal with some of these things that you're referring to, especially on advanced warning systems.
What happens with a false alarm in those situations? If they said a famine was about to occur and then it didn't?
Well, we are only talking about the triggers of those events. So these things, you're going to get famine in these areas only under these very extreme events that are really measurable, right? And I think this is so key when it comes to these mitigation systems, is you don't look at the averages, you don't look at where, you have this flat plateau of prices. It's these extreme things where you know that there's a high correlation. And if it fails, it fails, right? It's just capital markets, somebody won, somebody lost. That's how it works.
Reactions?
Just a reaction to the insurance. I guess I'm too much of a political cynic because I don't think there's an insurance market where every human life is fungible. And I think there's a failure of insurance of what kind of human lives we prize and what value we assign to them. And this goes also to the price. Can this system recalibrate? Probably. Just about every single system can recalibrate. What will the cost of a recalibration be? In a previous life, I worked on neoliberalism and the imposition of market discipline in Eastern Europe and Latin America. Did it recalibrate? Well, in the case of Russia, never mind, but in most places it recalibrated. But man, there was a lot of suffering in that period. And I think we have to be very careful about saying the system will recalibrate, the prices will send a signal. Well, what's the price? Sorry, what's the cost of those price jumps? What are the consequences of those price jumps? So the system, there was a line in Mexico that used to be there in the 1980s. The macroeconomics are great, but the microeconomics suck. So the system itself can be made somewhat stable, but if you're inside the system, it might not look so stable to you. And I think we have to simply be aware of that. That's all I would argue.
Steve?
I just wanted to point out that insurance was actually part of the cause of the instability in the last market crash, right? We got this AIG lawsuit specifically because of that. And with the way that reinsurers now interconnect the insurance markets worldwide, it's probably the case that that's stabilizing, but one can certainly come up with scenarios in which that would cause a system-wide collapse.
To the regime?
Sure.
Question?
Oh.
Well, one overlooked area, in my opinion, in that regime theory is agency. and the level of agency, and you can have level, and the distinction between non-agency and agency is not non-state actors in civil society, right? So the Dutch case is a very nice example where the government itself took action and became or organized something like a niche. But I believe change happens at niches. It can also happen at those regime levels. But it also happens as a response to a shock at higher long-term trend level. But that's what we don't want, right? And that's the risk that we were discussing before. That can we play God and intervene at high level without knowing what will happen? And I say, well, we have to be careful. Rather go to the niche level and nurture those things that we can overlook. And then couple those and create good examples for an alternative rather than trying to change the DNA or the grammar without knowing what the likely outcome will be.
So it's 12:20 now. We started a little late, so I don't know if we want one more round of questions. Okay.
Can I just one more point about the paranoid colonel in some sub-basement in the Pentagon, his or her equivalent throughout the world? You can actually see this this tool that a graduate student of mine developed, which is mapping trade. You see China doing this. From 1990, if you look at China's cereal imports and food imports, what you see is increasingly the circle trying to get smaller, and the circle trying to avoid the ocean. And you can imagine some kind of program saying, if we're going to be food dependent, we want to make sure that we can be food dependent with flows that can't be stopped by the Pacific Fleet. So yes, there are people who are actually thinking about this, and you can begin to see some sort of evidence of how this plays out on a strategic level.
Okay, so last round of questions. Yeah.
I think we're talking about two different things that are definitely interrelated, kind of part of the same whole. But one is the complexity you talk about, and the other one's efficiency. And we tend to go for efficiency within complex systems, and I think that's where the problem arises. Because in terms of efficiency, then what you want to do is you want to remove the redundancy, because redundancy has costs. You want to remove the flexibility and adaptability, because that when you go to a flexible, adaptable system, then you don't have a highly specialized system where you're just focusing on one thing. You have to do more than one thing, so you lose the gains of specialization. And when you go to systems that are dependent, interdependent kinds of systems, then you reduce the transactions cost. You've got the direct relationships. So the problem is when you go toward efficiency with strategies such as this in a highly complex system. In a highly complex system, you don't really know where all of those interconnections are. You don't know when you're going to run into something where your dependency and your lack of flexibility is going to cause a major problem. If you could really define that whole system, then perhaps it would be okay. But the human body is a complex system. I think that's a good example of it. We don't know what all the interactions are within the human body. And so we tend to do things that try to keep humans healthy rather than assume that we can fix them if anything goes wrong. And I think that's what's true of managing sustainable agriculture systems. We're talking about complex systems. So we leave a degree of redundancy, adaptive management, flexibility. We internalize dependency. Same way with the global sustainable food system, we have to do the same kind of thing.
Maybe one or two more questions. Is that it? Okay.
Just have a quick comment that there's one thing I'm concerned about is this preparation for this resilience, and also the connectivities among the countries' markets might have a different impact on developing countries and developed countries. And for the developed country, as the developed country get more sophisticated in preparing for or making their system more resilient, it might have some impact on the developing countries. And on the other hand, the developing countries, and they are because they have the more demands in gaining more economic development. So a lot of farmers might switch some of the cereal production to the cash crop production. And so once there's some, so that might make the system for their own country less resilient to some of the production shock. So yeah, that's my comments on that.
Anybody else? Okay. Any reactions to that, both on the sort of the trade-offs between complexity and resilience and efficiency?
Just on the bounded rationality problem, it's not only that we can't imagine what this thing looks like. We don't have the information. One of my favorite stories from 2008 is some of these credit swaps and all these various instruments that were used to securitize risk. Well, it turned out that the base documents were 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 pages long. So absolutely nobody knew who owed what to whom. And it would have taken an army of accountants, I don't know how many years to figure this out. So not only is the thing massive and complex, but we don't even know where the pipes are. We're essentially relying on a system of pipes that we don't necessarily have a map for. And on the resilience, certainly those of you who work on food and in Africa know much more about this than I do. The push towards cash crop makes a lot of sense in comparative advantage unless the market prices of your cash crop goes in a different slope from your staple that you're buying on. I mean, that to me, again, it makes a lot more sense for Colombia to grow flowers, or for Kenya, environmentally apparently not, doesn't make any sense, but for Kenya to grow flowers. But if the flower market busts, and you got to pay for your corn imports, so no crisis need happen, no Malacca Straits need to be closed. All you have to do is flowers went out of season, or flowers went out of, and you're stuck. There was I don't know how many of you remember New Coke. New Coke, the formula for New Coke, this is relevant for a moment. One of the things it took out was clothes. And for about a year, as New Coke was managing, the Malagasy economy almost collapsed because its dependence on clothes. So some scientist in Atlanta says, we don't need clove anymore in the New Coke. So thank God that old Coke came back for the Malagasy economy. So it's this kinds of fragilities that I think we have to be very aware of.
All right. Last thought from him. I guess over to you. And Heather.
Well, we have coffee first, right?
No.
Okay, folks. I think it's been a fascinating day, and I think it's incredibly successful exchange of information, and certainly learning for me, and I hope for most of you. I'm amazed that we can get very distinguished scientists and somewhat unsecure younger scientists to limit their expositions to 5 minutes. That's an incredible achievement on both sides.
Great
I mean, all the presenters have been able to boil down things to a point that we can begin to grapple this enormous complexity of our subject. What I've done there, and it's only good, it's my summary only for yesterday's morning. So I thought I could do more while going, but it was so exciting that I said no. I think we're going to need a little more time. The idea there is to try to boil down what we said here to a bunch of points, and what I like you to think about is what bullet points you have in this list that you think are sheer nonsense or not useful. And then think in your way, what other simple, pithy bullet points you would like to add to the list. And this will be the building blocks of the longish paper, of what we hope to have a 2-page policy form paper in Science or in Nature or something like that, that obviously cannot cover the depths at which we've gone here. So let me just try that. And this is just for yesterday's morning, not anymore. Agriculture is inherently risky because of weather and prices. I said that. Expect surprises. Mark said that. This risk is exacerbated by climate change and price volatility and food insecurity. A lot of people said that. Then the basics, the numbers. Oh, no. The issue of rain-fed. The fact people don't really, very few people really know this. And 90% of our cropland in the US and Europe is rain-fed. That only 10% of our cropland is irrigated. But pretty much, if we ask anyone, you'll say the opposite. You'll flip it and say the opposite. So that's why there's a lot of risks. Irrigated agriculture is less risky. There's an inherent lack of sustainability, I'm quoting John here, because of excessive preoccupation about efficiency. I would call this the A380 paradox.
Economic efficiency. Economic efficiency.
Okay, good. Well, that's one. I have Mark here changing.
So it could be ecological efficiency, other efficiency.
This is a brainstorm. So anything you say is acceptable. This is the idea of brainstorming. This is just to get it going. Okay. I'll call this now the A380 paradox after Michael's description of his buddy, the pilot of an A380. That is perfect, but boy, if something fails, I don't think I want to fly that plane. But we are, in excessive preoccupation, but I don't want to say normally economic, but I don't know, other things. Anyway, the point is not to discuss these things, the point is to get the idea. I want to get you a sense, and everything is open, and we like to do this in the most participatory way possible. All things that you guys said yesterday, food insecurity is a global climate and systemic crisis. Put some orders of magnitude there. Jessica said this, 800 million hungry, blah, 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 blah. The agricultural food value chain is global, but it's probably best looked at the regional or local scales. I would say because of this enormous differences in what levels or yield levels are we having. Agricultural food system poses a major risk to climate change. No, I'm not talking about the risk of climate change into agriculture, but the opposite. It accounts for 30%. I think Tim searching here. Yeah, you're here. I'm not quite sure I quoted you right of what you expect to get the 70% of greenhouse gas emissions by X time. So you may want to correct me in that. A new food system, Schengen said, which I found very interesting, is emerging, focusing more on accessibility, sustainable intensification, more focus on nutrition, focus on food safety, resiliency, and a lot of new players. And we could add security there and all sorts of things. Agricultural risk is certainly unlikely to motivate proactive action. This was Ezra yesterday. And as a psychologist, he taught us a lesson that why are people worried about what we're worried about? He elaborated on that. Well, this is just 10 or 12 bullet points. Now, and again, this is just what I got out of yesterday morning. So there's yesterday afternoon, there's today's morning. So I would like your help on this. And I would like a little bit of discussion now of the things that you consider so essential, what we said this morning or yesterday afternoon, and must be in the line of our main conclusions. And then later, we'll have to figure out committee-wise and all this stuff, what are our follow-ups. But I would say some of the follow-ups that we would ask each one of yours as you take the train back or the plane back and so on, to try to complete this list, or you can also scratch anything out of here. Okay, this is all brainstorming. So we can have a little product that we can circulate to all of you, say these are the main conclusions, sort of the headline news of what we have talked about. What do you think?
Sure, that sounds great. Let me just, I'll just say a couple of words. First of all, I think we all owe a huge round of applause to Thayer and to Carla Cook, because they have been the system managers all along, and they've made the system go. Second, I have to apologize. I made the risky decision of having children. And unfortunately, there's no redundancy for them. And I have to leave right before lunch. So my apologies to Pedro, my apologies to all of you that I have to leave. I want to leave just one substantive comment that I think would be worth for discussing later on. One of the things that struck me about all the conversations was how much you were treating agriculture as if it were a purely endogenous system in and of itself. And what I suggest we need to do is to expand that zone of endogeneity. That is, that the agricultural system we were talking about as if between the growth of the corn and the consumption of the cornflake, there were not a lot of various steps that rely on very complex systems in and of themselves. So whether we're talking about the internet allowing for a certain flow of prices, the revolution in Africa with the cell phones and how local farmers are now much, all those various systems make a difference on agriculture. Shipping, I didn't hear anyone talk about whether has there been a shipping revolution in agriculture similar to the container. And what are the issues involved in this kind of thing? So what I'm hoping we can do over the next year or so, as we continue to communicate, maybe we can get back together if we can find some funding, etc., is to really expand that zone of what the agricultural system might be, and it might take us very far away from soil or consumption, and to look at all those steps in between and how they themselves, may be subject to failure. And on that note, I will give it back to you, Bill.
Okay, I think that's another bullet point right there. So let's open it for more general ideas. Yeah, please.
One area that's not been discussed is the role of aquaculture. And there's many inputs into that system. The benefits of it are that you have a stable fish supply, and also decrease the problem of overfishing the oceans. But there's inherent risks involved with aquaculture, including using lots of antibiotics and the wastes that come out of aquaculture. So I'm just throwing that out there as something, it relates to ocean health and human health that I think should be somewhere included in this. It's not just terrestrial, but it's aquatic as well.
Right, very good. The definition of agriculture we're normally using is agriculture. You have the culture thing. Is human-dominated ecosystem that produces crops, livestock. We're not talking about elephants. We're talking about cows. Forestry, agroforestry, and fisheries. But the kind of fisheries we talk about are exactly the aquaculture, not the wild species. Those are sort of the limits, the broad limits of agriculture. You're absolutely right, and I think that's a good point to make. That aquaculture, as is growing very rapidly, has tremendous pluses and tremendous minuses, and that's certainly absolutely right. Thank you very much. Yeah. Okay, Otto.
I can't encapsulate it. But this last session this morning and the earlier session this morning really tried to focus on complexities of systems and how we deal with complex systems. And I think that has to be a question. I'm not sure we can answer it in this. But I would also argue that we're dealing with systems that are complex in ways that make reductionist science very difficult as the sole analytical tool to deal with them. That's why I brought up the wicked problem. But these systems that we're dealing with, I've hit it terribly hard in natural resources and soil conservation, in environmental preservation. It is almost impossible to look at the nexus of these and how you get decisions made in the nexus of these on a reductionist basis.
Yeah, well, let me just comment that the reductionism helps us a lot.
Yes.
But if you're a reductionist scientist, you shouldn't be here.
No, they can help. They're good people. Some of my best friends.
Some of your best friends are reductionists.
But you can't trust them to ride your bike.
No, nor my Lamborghini.
Very, very good point. Yes, back there, please.
Along the lines of things that haven't been discussed here that I think is important to think about is opportunities to improve food security in a way that's environmentally beneficial. And one thing that my group has worked on quite a bit is looking at air pollution and specifically surface ozone concentrations and how they bring yields down substantially for some crops. And so there's an opportunity then, if you can reduce air pollution, you can increase global food yields in a way that's environmentally very attractive. Or in areas where it's not possible to bring down those surface pollution levels, you can choose crop cultivars which are more inherently resistant to ozone and then boost yields. And this is something that's being discussed more in the research community right now, but it's been something that's been fairly invisible, I think, because as an example, in China, they've been developing hybrid rice cultivars that are very high yielding. Yes. And it was very unapparent that if those cultivars were grown in low ozone environments, the yield would have been even higher. And so there's opportunities here where you can have win-win situations as long as the system allows for identification and distribution of some of these opportunities.
Okay, so the issue of including the effects of air pollution are fine. Actually, you got trade-offs and synergies there. There's a massive epidemic of sulfur deficiency in crops now worldwide, particularly when we clean the air in the industrial countries. Now, and we make fertilizers so high in nitrogen, phosphorus, as there's no sulfur there. But even in places where there hasn't been a need to clean the air, we're getting the deficiencies because of the fertilizers. So, I'm showing a graph there of sulfur going down and between a couple of countries. Sulfur is an essential nutrient and is going down from our rainfall because of us cleaning the air. That's a trade-off, and I'm all for cleaning the air, but that's a trade-off. So we have to look at the ozone damage, yeah, but we have to look at other consequences of cleaning the air. Let me go to Mark here and then to Ezra back there. Mark.
So I see this short paper as maybe having 3 acts. One is the challenges in global agriculture. Second is an explanation of those challenges as a function of the systemic risk that's coupled across systems. The ones that are listed up there on the board. But then the third act is not in your notes yet, which is what to do about it, the implications for governance. If you think about the evolution from the Millennium Development Goals to Sustainable Development Goals, the MDGs had just zero, intelligence regarding systems. They were just very old-fashioned stocks and flows approaches to management. The SDGs have just a little epsilon movement towards systemic sensitivity, but it's still minuscule compared to the magnitude of the challenge we've laid out here. So I think it would be interesting to kind of, flesh that out and be really upfront about it.
Great idea, and absolutely. The MDGs were developed by politicians.
Just to follow up on what you said, the MDG proposed like 17 goals, maybe not 19 goals now, and 169 targets. What we can do here is to use a system approach, nexus approach, to achieve several goals together. And that's probably the strong recommendation or solution we can have. Because I heard about the challenges there, but I have not heard about potential solutions for us to work together to move forward.
But I think both are very, very good points. Saying that the MDGs were devised by politicians and UN bureaucrats, and with all respect to both of them, they came out with very different things. Cut hunger in half, and they ignore population, for example, and issues like that. So the SDGs, I think, are better in the sense because there's been more science in. But still, you have that weakness there, that we're talking about target 1 or target 2 and so on, and some of it, there might be trade-offs and synergies among several targets. That's an excellent point. So we're getting something here. Ezra.
So I would just quickly reiterate a point that I think Michael made, and it also came up in Keaton's discussion of kind of the more normative side of things, which is that we've been talking about what are the problems and some of the possible solutions. And the thing is that there are lots of different solutions. And each solution comes with its own costs. And so when we're thinking about managing risks, one of the things we're trying to do, right, is to smooth the hit that we get to well-being, writ large, when something bad happens. And we expect bad things to happen. That's what we're trying to do. But we can smooth that hit in different ways. We can borrow from the future. We can borrow from rich people today. Or we can set ourselves up to be able to smooth that by sacrificing in the past. And so we have different places where we can go. And some of that is just prescriptive, but some of it is also normative. We can try and lay out principles. We're trying to figure out, well, which solutions make the most sense when we're trying to maximize multiple goals, but trying to do it in a way that is fair, or whatever those kind of underlying principles might be. We have to pick what those are, rather than let them just be implicit in how we're making these decisions. I would add that.
Those really, really nice. Those are the three choices. I mean, from the past, from the rich, or from the future. And that's a very nice way of putting it to add to the third part of the article that Mark was mentioning.
What we're doing now is taking it from the poor.
Yes, sometimes we take from the poor.
Which is
that's number 4.
Yeah. Okay. Mark is he's trying to capture all this stuff. So I hope we can regurgitate it back to you.
I think what makes this gathering also different is this idea of systemic risk, and actually the fear that the whole system may collapse. That's what I really take away, that it's so complex, and could it come to a point where basically the whole world is scrambling and may not even achieve, or at very high cost. It's sort of the 2007-2008 financial crisis being repeated. There was a food crisis was happening at the same time, so that we got it all coming together. And how can that outcome, was that inherent to the system? And has anything changed really, or can we predict already that a repeat will happen? So we're 5 years further. Are the systems in place now, or have we improved so that at least on the food side, this is not going to repeat itself? And I think that is the overarching question, or that's how I interpret it, for this gathering. And I'm a bit afraid it's sort of this distinguishing that sort of risk is very different from the fact that rainfall is inherent volatile. And that's sort of, in a way, the profession has been dealing with that. There are different ways, etc. But the systemic part of it, I think, is what really distinguishes this from a lot of other work. And so maybe the focus of the 2-pager seems to be that's where, and that brings us to complexity. That brings us to the trade-off between efficiency and risk. So have we made the system so lean that it does lose any resilience? And I think the reflections around that is really what fascinated me in these 2 days.
Okay. Look, I'm going to ask you to work with Mark right afterwards to boil this down to a couple of sentences, because that was the speech and that was great. But let's see if we can get the gist out of that into our written parts.
Yeah, I was just going to follow up on what you're saying. I don't think the economic situation is any better than it was before the crash of 2008. If you look at where the global economy is today, all the countries are doing everything they can to make the economy move, and it is included. It's just hanging on the edge. We're writing huge budget deficits. We've got 0 interest rates for 4 or 5 years now. Before we fight a war and get us out of a recession, we've been fighting fear of war. I don't think we can afford any more. So I think if you're counting on the economy somehow being stronger and bailing us out, I think the economist is counting on the people again to bail them out if everything collapses. So that's not a very encouraging thing, but I think it's something we have to deal with. It's all tied up. It's a very risky time in human history.
Thank you, Joe. Cheryl?
Yeah, I've learned an amazing amount in the last day and a half. And so I really like what Luke said, and I know there are lots of groups talking about agricultural risks. So are there people that are involved in these? You know, you said a big systemic issue. What else is different about this group and some of these other groups that Michael's involved in, other people? It would be interesting to hear that. Is it just repeating what other people are doing, or is there something different that really should be highlighted?
Okay, other thoughts? Yes?
So when I've been talking about the resilience from the production side and also the whole delivery system, we didn't touch much on the kind of the resilience side from the demand or the consumer. It's extremely, or it's probably especially important for, say, the currently richer countries, where kind of adapted to larger consumption of the meat and large consumption of fruit in a beautiful shape. So that's kind of driving from this food delivery system is trying to meet that demand, and so it's not necessarily, it's kind of spoiling the consumer side, and I think the response from the consumer would be also important.
So, can you give me a bullet point? just one sentence of what you're saying.
And what I'm saying is the consumption or the people's diet should be also directed in the right way, considering both the health impact and also the environment impact.
Okay, so it's look at the consumption side more, look at the resilience,
yeah,
and in terms of health and in terms of economics. Good, we got three more. Otto, and then I'm just going to go this way. Yeah.
We have assumed for the last several days the human factor. In essence, that we will have the management skills, that we will have the trained people, that we will have farmers that will do the right thing, whether it's a local level setting decisions or not. We really sort of assumed away the whole human capital factor.
Mm-hmm. I think that's very true. We haven't talked of the needs for training and this kind of stuff. We assume that we got all the brains that we need to do that, and obviously we don't. Yeah.
Following up on what she said, I think one of the things that's been so beneficial about this particular forum has been it's been so interdisciplinary. I mean, usually we are in our little silos talking with people in our own fields, and we speak the same language, and just trying to understand everybody else's different professional language has been really interesting. And I think approaching some of these wicked problems really requires a very multidisciplinary approach, scientifically, economically, legally. Everything that people have brought to the table needs to be looked at in this holistic way and not just one discipline.
Yeah. Oh no, absolutely. And please don't use acronyms, or if you use them, define them, because we don't know your local tribal language, and you don't know mine, and so on. So very, very well point. Hey.
Yeah, just to follow this series of comments, I think for the paper in particular, for the third part that Mark.
Can you talk a little louder, please?
Yeah, for the third part of the paper that Mark suggested, I think there's a series of initiatives or forums where food security is being discussed by a number of different people. So there's a multiple red pastor failure initiative and initiative, and there's several think tanks. There's that I think of that are carrying out an agenda on food security, and this, as you said, is I know of a few of these is by far the more interdisciplinary and place that I can think of. Maybe you would know many more, and that is really taken from ground up. And really interesting work. And then, well, I think the differences and the added value of this work needs to be made explicit, and how it adds up to other conversations that are taking place. And yeah, I think this needs to be made quite explicit and towards the question of governance. Miguel.
Thank you. I think I'm going to stop it here because of time. We've been incredibly good at time. But thank you very much for everybody. We'll figure out, the organizers, how to get back to all of you, have your email addresses. And I think it's been wonderful. I want to thank again Thayer and Carla. I want to thank our process policemen, several postdocs who sat here. And kept us on time. So let's go have some lunch outside. Thanks very much.